Hello again, book lovers, and now it's the turn of Speech, How Language Made Us Human by Simon Prentis. This is almost an exception. I'm going to critique this one as I don't think it lived up to the potential. I just checked into Goodreads to see what other people thought about this book, and a lot of them coincide with me in thinking that it's not what it says on the tin. It's a very wide-ranging book, taking in lots of different fields, such as culture, faith, personal identity, sex, drugs, music, memes and genes, etc., etc. But almost none of it, and here's where I coincide with the other reviewers, actually went into the history and development of speech, which was what I really wanted to find in it. Something to expand my knowledge a little bit there. Yes, it does dip its toes into many fascinating areas, but to be honest, that's all it does. It dips its toes in, and if you really are interested in the history of language, especially the English language, which admittedly this book is not restricted to, I would recommend books by David Crystal, for example, by Martin Gardner and Tony Ogard, all of whom I've read and enjoyed, and who gave me a little bit more insight into the tricks and turns of speech, which is, after all, the subject matter of this volume. I ended up reading it quite quickly, but unfortunately, because I skimmed through the last part, which was a little bit TLDR, and I'm sorry to say, perhaps the worst criticism I could ever give of any book, film, piece of music, or whatever, it's quite boring, and even ends with a rejected thesis of his, which kind of summarises the main details. Any insights gained would perhaps be contained in this, but again, I didn't find it very interesting, so I'm going to critique it, if you don't mind. My first bone to pick, unless I've understood this badly, is that on page 7 he says, and I quote, "The International Phonetic Alphabet uses over 150 symbols to represent all the known sounds used by humans in their languages, but no language uses them all, or even most of them." Whereas turning to page 9, we learn that the Khoisan group of so-called click languages in Africa use as many as 24 vowels and 117 consonants. Even taking into account that he's talking about a group of languages, I think this contradicts what he's just said 2 pages before. Some of the interesting doors which are opened up are, unfortunately for this clever clogs, doors which I've already been through. For example, the identical twins studies, particularly Jack Ufer and Oscar Stohr, who were as different as chalk and cheese and yet shared many genetic traits. And here again, I can't really work out what Mr. Prentis is saying. The nature versus nurture debate seems to be a false one to me. If you really wanted to go into that in much more detail and in a more entertaining fashion, I would recommend The Language Instinct, which was the subject of my book review number 2, and other books by Steven Pinker. And if you're interested in the neurological aspect of it, or the neuroscience, why not try some Daniel Dennett or some Richard Dawkins, who, along with Pinker, gives this book a puff on the front cover, along with Yoko Ono. Moving into what he calls the trap of identity, we get into some murky philosophical waters, and for all the citing of Chinese sages and Renaissance thinkers, it doesn't really present a clear thesis. Let me skim through to page 108, and again I quote, "If I say an elephant in a red dress comes into the room holding a blue ball, you immediately have a very clear image of that in your head. You can't help imagining what it looks like as if you were there." Well, I didn't, and I couldn't. How's the elephant holding the ball? The elephant doesn't have any fingers. Was he balancing on the ends of his stumpy legs? Again, I found this a little bit sloppy. And on the very next page we get the equivalence of the word soul, where he's discussing the notion of soul, with which I broadly agree, I have to say, using the examples of soul music and soul food. Again, soul food, a concept I've never really understood. I think it's just a loose tagging on of the word soul to the word food to make it sound a little bit special. Again, staying with the trap of identity, as he calls it, there is a nice little taking apart of the idea of what Britain is, what England is, or Albion, or St George, again, with which I agree, but which I suggest is a point that's been made many times over. On page 142, where we're now talking about sex, drugs and music, and by the way, I kept thinking all the way through this, yeah, but what's this got to do with speech? Which is supposed to be what the book's about. Anyway, quite an entertaining chapter. Here he is. Thus was born the vibrator, at first produced solely for the use of the medical profession. From the early years of the 20th century, it was made available as a consumer product that rapidly became a must-have item for legions of sexually frustrated gentlewomen, etc., etc. Oh, Mr. Prentis never heard of the cunning Greek, I believe it was the ancient Greek women who invented the tube filled with live wasps. And I'll say no more about that. The third of a chapter on drugs is one which I completely and utterly agree with, as it happens. But here's the thing about this book is a lot of the parts I didn't agree with. I'm guessing Mr. Prentis is pretty liberal in the English sense of the word. But what I find, for example, with Matt Ridley's books, where I might not be in tune with the politics of them, is that he makes such a good case for the other side. I'm led to question myself and think, blimey, I hadn't thought of that before. And again, I repeat, I am a bit of a clever clogs, and I'm over 60 years old, and I've read a lot of books, and so a lot of the stuff that was supposed to be insightful here wasn't so to me. We go through science, we go through Einstein, we go through some papal encyclicals, and the book is full of, as I say, interesting facts. Some of which I did pause to look up. For example, the thorough debunking of the 21 grams experiment. A nice idea which has been circulating ever since 1907 when Duncan McDougall decided to weigh bodies at the point of death in an effort to establish whether or not there was something that, in inverted commas, escaped from the body, which you might call a soul. The sample size is pathetic, the animal experiments, as usual, were cruel, etc., etc. And that was a nice little sideline. But if we're going to talk about science and be very picky, how about this for a black swan fallacy? Page 190, quote, "If you've been to Korea, brackets, or even just to a Korean restaurant, brackets, you'll know they are the only culture in the world to use metal chopsticks." Well, how? I'd have to have visited every country in the world to know that. Do the Koreans say, "We are the only country that uses metal chopsticks"? And if so, where's your evidence? Sloppy in my book, Mr. Prentis. And finally, as I think you get the gist now, this is a book that you might want to read if you're interested in wide-ranging topics of interest that branch out here and there. In the chapter called Food for Thought, we read about another of nature's and history's puzzles. What triggered the increase in brain size in human beings? And here we get a few theories. Was it socialization? Was it precisely because we started using language? He doesn't mention the argument that I'm familiar with as a vegan, that it's because we started eating meat, that's what made our brains bigger, that's what made us cleverer. My little alarm bells went off because our brains aren't as big as they have ever been. Indeed, Mr. Prentis mentions Einstein's 18% smaller than average brain. But at least he does redeem this error with a passing comment a few pages later on the domestication of the human species, meaning that we just don't have to think about things as much as we used to. But again, it's a little bit here, there and everywhere. As we reach the end, as I say, I sadly began to skip over the pages because I found the writing very wordy. So there you go, that's a first for this series. I'm not going to recommend this book. There are others that have dealt with the themes in better written and more entertaining ways. And to reiterate my initial criticism, the subtitle, How Language Made Us Human, seems to just be an excuse to write about things that pop into his head. Again, to contrast with the Matt Ridley book, The Evolution of Everything, I thought that was very well united across its chapters and had a strong central tenet. This one doesn't. However, if you'd like to read something short and entertaining, I keep forgetting to recommend my book. Here might be a great place to do it. Nothing to do with the theme at hand here, but if you'd like to read a jocular and rather slight historical novel, quotes, based on true events, end quotes, why not try my book, Skip Delirio's Worst Ever Gig? At least there's a good few laughs in it.